It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the Emory University Office of Spiritual and Religious Life Black History Month lecture for 2021. I'm Greg McGonigal, the Dean of Religious Life at Emory, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you today, and especially to welcome home our featured speaker, the Reverend Adam Russell Taylor, the new president of Sojourners. Thank you, Adam, so much for accepting our invitation to come home to Emory virtually today and join us and speak to us. Adam is a 1998 graduate of Emory College, and our president, Greg Fenvez, is with us to offer a more complete introduction. But I just wanted to mention that while Adam was at Emory, he was also a proud member of our Voices of Inner Strength Gospel Choir under the direction of OSRL's music director, Mr. Emory Allums. And we are so delighted to have with us today many from the Voices community. And thanks to an excellent idea by Dr. Angelette Tucker of the President's Office, there will be a virtual reception for Voices members today, immediately following Reverend Taylor's talk. So we hope that Voices members past and present can join us in that reunion. I might note that everyone can hear the Voices Choir regularly at our Sunday morning Beloved Community worship services at 11 a.m. on Sundays, currently online, usually in Cannon Chapel. And this semester, you can also hear Mr. Emory Allums every Wednesday at noon online for our midweek musical reflections, which is a new program, but very popular, and we hope you might consider joining us for those opportunities. In today's presentation, after an introduction by President Fenvez, Reverend Adam will speak about his journey and his current vision for Sojourners for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then he would really like to engage with us in conversation. And so we welcome your questions and comments in the question and answer feature. And in addition, Reverend Adam and Sojourners have also generously offered us discounted subscriptions for anyone who would like to join Sojourners. So please find that information in the chat. We'll also email that out to attendees after today's presentation. It would be excellent to support their very important work. I want to deeply thank all those who partnered with us to present today's lecture, including Reverend Adam and his team, the Emory Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Emory Campus Life, and the Office for Racial and Cultural Engagement, Candler School of Theology, Black Church Studies, and Glenn Memorial Church. And now it's my honor to introduce Emory's president, Greg Fenvez. President Fenvez joined Emory last summer during the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and racial injustice. And he has been a strong supporter of our interfaith spiritual life and a leader in Emory's ongoing efforts to advance racial and social justice. Thank you all again for being here, and welcome, President Fenvez.
All right, thank you, Dean McGonigal. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so pleased to join today to hear our lecture and welcome the new president of Sojourners, the Reverend Adam Taylor, who began his journey right here at Emory University. For years, Reverend Taylor's work has focused on the intersections of faith, advocacy, and social justice, and exploring how activism and the story of faith can advance justice as a spiritual calling. Reverend Taylor recognized early that his faith compelled him to address the issues of justice. And he credited the roots of that awakening taking hold here in Atlanta while he was an undergraduate student at Emory College. One Sunday, while attending the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, where, as you all know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once was the pastor, Reverend Taylor heard a sermon connecting Christianity with the call for social justice. And he's described it as something just clicked with him. After graduating from Emory in 1998 with a bachelor's degree in international studies, Reverend Taylor would go on to earn degrees from Harvard University Kennedy School of Government and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. After graduation, he served as a co-founder and executive director of Global Justice, an organization that educates and mobilizes students around issues related to global human rights and criminal justice. In 2005, Reverend Taylor joined Sojourners, a Christian organization that integrates a spiritual renewal with social justice, mobilizing the people of faith to take action to advance justice and peace. After serving as political director and executive director last month, he was appointed president, where he will continue to shape strategies for empowering faith-based social change. He was a former White House fellow under the Obama administration. Reverend Taylor also served as a faith and advocacy leader at the World Bank Group and World Vision US. Today, he is a recognized, passionate champion for justice and human rights, committed to building bridges and finding common ground. And I must say, in these challenging times, I can't think of a more important calling, as together we have watched the nation confront the devastating and unequal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the horrific acts of racial injustice that have played out across the country, and most notably and memorably in the form of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and here in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery and Rayshard Brooks. Yet through all the suffering and the tragedy of this past year, a renewed movement for equality and justice has been born in this country. And with it, a new generation of activists compelled by the urgent call to end anti-Black racism and structural racism. This new activism is exactly the kind of bold moral leadership and spiritual accountability Reverend Taylor calls for in his book, Mobilizing Hope, Faith-Inspired Activism for a Post-Civil Rights Generation. And in it, he talks about faith and belief and how it can drive social movements capable of changing the course of history, creating the kind of change agents our world so desperately needs. And at this critical moment in history, Reverend Taylor has risen to be a change agent in his very own right. And we are very proud to welcome him back to Emory for this evening's lecture in celebration of Black History Month. So now, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Adam Taylor.
Thank you, President Fenvez and Dean McGonigal. So grateful for the invitation to be with you. I want to thank the Emory Office of Spiritual and Religious Life for hosting me today. I want to, unfortunately, start on a little bit of a somber note. I want to dedicate this lecture, this speech, to two of my beloved brothers of the Mu Alpha chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Both Judge Horace Johnson and Howard Smith went on to glory this past year and left us, but their memory and legacy lives on. I can't tell you how much I wish I could be there in person. I've done a lot of virtual speaking, probably more speaking than normal because I don't have to travel to get to a place, but Emory is one place I really wish that I could be in person. Nonetheless, I'm grateful that we can be together virtually. I actually had the opportunity to visit Emory for the first time in a number of years. A little over a year ago, I'd been invited by Payne College to give a Martin Luther King lecture. And I used that opportunity to have a reunion with four of my closest friends, all of whom I met at Emory. It is true that Emory enables you to build lifelong friendships, and these four friends are literally like an extended family of mine. We had a chance to go back to Emory's campus, and I have to say that the Emory of the 1990s is very different than the Emory of 2021. I'm a little envious of your new student center and your world-class cafeteria. I hope you don't take that for granted. And while much has changed, there's also much that remains the same. The spirit of Dooley still seems to be quite alive and well. The athletic center is pretty much exactly as I remembered it. And the university's commitment to hosting dialogue about issues of justice continues, just like it is right now. I want to just say a quick word about Sojourners. You already heard about it, so I won't say much more, but I would encourage you to check out our website at www.sojo.net. We'd love for you to subscribe to the magazine, but we also have a free digital newsletter that any of you can access. It helps to compile a lot of our digital content that speaks to the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. And I was unfortunate because I didn't discover Sojourners until after my time at Emory. And I wish I had discovered it so much earlier. So I'm inviting you to join our community at sojo.net. Now, it is true that I am a Black Baptist preacher, but I haven't come to give a traditional sermon today. Instead, in the context of Black History Month, I want to draw on the timeless wisdom of a modern day prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose sermon provides the very inspiration for the title of this lecture, Following the Path of a Transformed Nonconformist. Dr. King is most well known for his speeches and books, but often his sermons get overlooked. As a son of Atlanta and of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. King was first and foremost a Baptist preacher. And in one of my favorite sermons by Dr. King, he preached from Romans chapter 12, The text that says, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And Dr. King offers his own sanctified remix of Paul's words. Dr. King says, the saving of our world from pending doom will come not through the complacent adjustment of a conforming majority, but through the creative maladjustment of a non-conforming minority. Now, I know it's a mouthful, but I love this dual commitment to being creatively maladjusted to the world around us and to being a non-conforming minority. That quote literally became the very foundation for my book, Mobilizing Hope, that the president just mentioned. I believe that what Dr. King was trying to get at is that our faith, not just in the Christian faith, but I think this is true of other faith traditions in Judaism and Islam, requires us to be maladjusted to the world around us, particularly to its brokenness, particularly to the injustices that we see so prevalently in our world. It also requires us to resist those forms of overt and covert injustice. From the Christian tradition, the Beatitudes provide the very kingdom ethics for creative maladjustment. Jesus instructs us that blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, blessed are the merciful, and blessed are the peacemakers. But it's not enough to just have a maladjusted mindset, because as the book of James reminds us in the Christian faith, faith without works is dead. And in a similar way, creative maladjustment without a commitment to action can also be dead. Dr. King pushes us further to become a non-conforming minority. This means that we have to make a decision to get in the way of injustice and use our time and talents to advance a radically more just nation and world. Far too often, many of us in the Christian faith have de-radicalized Christ. The life and teachings of Jesus, who was a poor, brown Palestinian Jew, who upended the realities of his time, can't be fully understood apart from his social, political, and economic context. In truth, as Dr. King preaches, Christ was the quintessential transformed nonconformist. But before we go deeper into Christ's story, I want to share a little bit about my own story. I grew up believing that I had been born in the wrong era. My Black mother and white father made the controversial decision to marry each other in 1968, the same year that Dr. King was assassinated, and the year after the Supreme Court struck down laws across the country that banned interracial marriage through a Supreme Court case, Loving versus the state of Virginia. Now, my parents instilled in me a deep and abiding belief that my diversity and diversity in general was a strength and not a weakness. They also instilled in me this belief that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. They started a life together in a place called Bellingham, Washington, which is north of Seattle, because they believed that was a place where racism wouldn't be the dominant factor in their lives. Later, when I was 16, I was uprooted and moved to Tucson, Arizona. I was not a fan of that move at the time, but it actually became one of the best things that happened to me, because I realized just how much I craved greater racial diversity. I ended up going to the most racially diverse high school in Tucson at the time, Amphitheater High School. And I became quickly mesmerized by the civil rights struggle. I tried to read every book I could get my hands on, including the series by Taylor Branch. That was around the same time that the documentary series Eyes on the Prize came out. And if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend that you watch it. And by the time I got to Emory, I started to sense that my generation, Generation X, was suffering from a condition that I later termed the activist deficit disorder. Now, I'm not trying to diss my own peeps. Love Generation X. But many of us started to take for granted the struggles that came before us. And some of us even embraced a mindset of getting mine and getting paid. This mentality was reinforced by a false theology that started to become popular and was seeping into the church around that same time, which I often refer to as the bling bling gospel, otherwise known as the prosperity gospel. It's a theology, it's a gospel that often reduces God to a heavenly ATM machine who doles out material blessings and favors to those who are most faithful. In the prosperity gospel, the focus of faith becomes overly transactional. It becomes focused on what we can get from God, rather than how through a transforming and redemptive relationship with God, God enlists us in God's purposes in the world, When I was a student at Emory, I yearned for a modern day equivalent of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Now, this was almost 2 decades before the Black Lives Matter movement was birthed after the death of Trayvon Martin in 2013. We didn't have an equivalent of BLM when I was a student at Emory. And then for my generation, many of us had become cynical about politics and started substituting service for civic activism. Now, don't get it twisted. I am a huge believer in the importance of community service. It is the glue that holds our society together. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a proud member of the same fraternity as Dr. King, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And our motto is, first of all, service to all, we shall transcend all. But service and activism are very different. And the pursuit of justice is not primarily a charitable enterprise. Service and charity do help to meet immediate needs, but they often can place a Band-Aid on an open sore of injustice, or even at worst, disempowering the very people that you are trying to serve. In contrast, justice requires getting to the root causes behind people's suffering and pain. And these root causes are so often tied to some form of domination, exploitation, violence, or exclusion from community. Yes, justice requires dealing with the unjust systems and attitudes and laws and policies that are so necessary. Our nation, and I would argue many parts of the church, have often suffered from a pathological individualism, whether it's through the civic religion of rugged individualism or a form of Christianity that reduces the gospel to personal salvation. And as a result, we have an overly anthropological understanding of justice rather than a sociological understanding of justice. That ultimately we must transform systems and institutions that are causing and perpetuating harm. Now, Dr. King and so many civil rights leaders like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and John Lewis understood that no amount of charity or goodwill could erase and tear down the system of Jim Crow segregation. No, that required a fundamental change in law, which they were able to achieve through the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In a similar fashion, no amount of service will end the modern day forms of racism, like through racialized policing and the system of mass incarceration, which Professor Michelle Alexander so aptly referred to as the new Jim Crow. Those will require transformations in systems and in laws. When we compare the dark days of Jim Crow segregation to today, it is true that we have come a mighty long way. Hard-fought victories of the civil rights movement paved the way for a series of firsts. I'm proud that my mother became the first Black woman to graduate from DePauw University in Indiana, and then become the first African-American to serve as a vice president at the University of Arizona. In 2008, we witnessed the election of our nation's first Black president, Barack Obama, who I had the privilege of serving with for a year in the White House. And just a few months ago, we saw the election of our first Black woman, an Asian woman, vice president of the United States, Kamala Harris. But we can't simply hail racial progress while ignoring the deep-seated and ongoing racial pain and injustice that is still in our midst. And when we look out at the landscape of America today, Dr. King's dream is so often being deferred. When 1 in 4 Black children grow up in the quicksand of poverty, dreams are being deferred. When less than half of African Americans graduate from high school compared to 78% of whites, dreams are being deferred. When Black joblessness is twice that of whites and Black wealth is 1/10 that of white Americans, dreams are being deferred. When 1 in 3 Black men are currently under the control of the criminal justice system, dreams are being deferred. When Asian Americans are being victimized by racist violence in the context of COVID right now, dreams are being deferred. And when Black and brown Americans are so much more likely to contract and die of COVID-19, dreams are being deferred. Yes, beloved, we are living in some trying and turbulent times that require the activism and the commitment of transformed nonconformists. Using Dr. King's words, there are signs of pending doom all around us. From record cold fronts in Texas being fueled by climate change to deep economic hardship all across this land. As a nation, we experienced one of the most dangerous and alarming moments in our history when rioters on January 16th laid siege on the US Capitol, seeking to overturn the 2020 election results through insurrection. This violent insurrection was fueled by the flames of a big lie that the election was stolen, and by the even bigger lie of white supremacy and white nationalism that we still have not been able to vanquish in this country. I believe that President Trump helped to incite that insurrection and certainly helped to promulgate the big lie that widespread voter fraud led to a stolen election. Even today, polls show that 70% of Republicans still believe the election was stolen, which serves as a major stumbling block for how we try to find a way to come together as a country to solve our most pressing problems. Yes, we are at an inflection point in our nation's politics, where I believe we face an essential choice between a politics of division or a politics of the common good. The politics of division trades in fear, hatred, and hypocrisy, the very things that theologian and mystic Howard Thurman referred to as the three hounds of hell. In contrast, the politics of the common good emphasize how we can solve common problems. It emphasizes empathy and even sometimes compromise. The politics of division stokes an us versus them and a zero-sum mentality. It reasserts the lie that some Americans are worth more than others, and is so often fueled by falsehoods, hyper-selfishness, and efforts to erode public trust in institutions and the media. Yes, the virus of toxic polarization is a real and present danger in our body politic. But so is the virus of systemic racism, which we know has been with our nation since its inception, disfiguring American democracy and betraying our nation's promise, assaulting human dignity. Racism is not simply offensive slurs or statements. It has literally become ingrained in our culture and our institutions and our policies in ways that continue to harm and disadvantage people of color, particularly Black Americans. And the racial awakening that took place over the summer after the senseless and brutal killings of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, that sparked a wave of largely peaceful protests around the country, has forced us to ask the pressing question: will this awakening lead to deeper and permanent policy change and transformation in policing and public safety, or will it simply just be a flash in the pan? Sadly, a survey by a polling firm called PRI found that even after all that we saw this summer, approximately 8 in 10 Republicans and 7 in 10 white evangelical Protestants continue to say that the recent killings of Black men by police are isolated incidents rather than a part of how police treat African Americans. In other words, as a part of a broader pattern of injustice that needs to be addressed. This is deeply distressing, and I would argue is at least in part a fundamental failure of discipleship. We have not been discipling people into a commitment to anti-racism in the way that we should. Of course, there is no magic bullet or single cure for the virus of systemic racism and toxic polarization. But I believe that our faith traditions provide us timeless wisdom that can and must be used to combat these viruses. Now, it's important to remember that social movements always start with a small, committed minority. History often glosses over the fact that the majority of Blacks in the South were not directly involved in the civil rights struggle. In fact, the majority of Black churches were resistant to joining the civil rights struggle. This is largely why Dr. King's denomination, which happens to be my own, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, split off from the National Baptist Convention that was resistant to embracing the civil rights struggle. And I'm only sharing that story to remind us just how a few of us can light the spark that can create a combustible charge of social and political change. So you may be asking yourself, what does the path of the transformed nonconformist require? Well, I'm glad you asked. I believe that we can gain some wisdom by first starting in the Old Testament story of David and Goliath. Travel with me for a second back to ancient Israel, just as the Israelites are fighting the mighty Philistine giant named Goliath. Now, no one has the courage to face the mighty Philistine in battle until a young shepherd boy named David volunteers and steps forward. David is the very definition of an underdog. And I believe that many of the challenges we face around us, whether it's COVID-19 pandemic, the pandemic of systemic racism, climate change, and others, can often feel like a modern day Goliath. They can make us feel as though we are powerless. They can lead us to a sense of resignation and a sense of cynicism. But this is where faith can intervene. If you remember the story, initially King Saul gives David a mighty sword and armor, and David quickly realizes these conventional weapons are useless to him. And David uses his sanctified imagination to reconfigure the battlefield according to the unique gifts that God has given him. He remembers how God enabled him to overcome a lion with a slingshot and stones. And so David finds five smooth stones in the brook, and he uses one of them to knock down the mighty Philistine, and then uses his sword to cut off his head. And I'm sharing this story because I believe that God has given all of us some unique stones that are critical for how we follow the path of the transformed nonconformist. And I want to close by emphasizing quickly what I think these 5 stones are, and they're stones that are available to all of us. The first is what I call the stone of pragmatic solidarity. One of Dr. King's most famous quotes is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." This speaks to solidarity in a very powerful way, similar to what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, that the church and our society more broadly literally functions like a human body. And when one part of the body suffers, all parts suffer with it. And that the weakest parts of the body are actually the most indispensable. I learned a great deal about pragmatic solidarity when I had a chance to travel to Haiti for my first time in 1999 with Dr. Paul Farmer and Dr. Jim Kim, who co-founded an organization called Partners in Health. According to Dr. Farmer, pragmatic solidarity is both the desire to make common cause with those in need and to offer goods and demand justice to diminish their hardship. Pragmatic solidarity requires a regular dose of moral indignation and righteous anger, because without solidarity, our activism risks becoming formulaic and numb to the realities faced by those whose backs are up against the wall. And solidarity must be intimate and proximate to those most impacted by injustice. I remember after spending some time in South Africa, I encountered a t-shirt that had the words HIV emblazoned on the front, HIV positive. This was at the height of the AIDS pandemic in the early 2000s. The t-shirt was created by the founder of the Treatment Action Campaign, a guy named Zaki Ahmad, who was a lawyer, who literally put his life on the line because even though he could afford anti-AIDS drugs, he refused to take them until the majority of Black South Africans also had access to anti-AIDS drugs. He remembered how during World War II, the King of Denmark wore the Star of David in order to defy the Nazis and protect Jews from being sent to Holocaust camps. His act of solidarity inspired Christians across Denmark to also wear the Star of David, so that the Nazis wouldn't be able to tell who was Jewish and who was Christian. I believe it is such a brilliant example of what solidarity looks like. In a similar vein, the Treatment Action Campaign created these t-shirts so that people who were living with HIV wouldn't face the same stigma and the same rejection that they had been encountering in the early days of the AIDS pandemic, and that people who were not HIV negative could show solidarity with people that are HIV positive. Well, Dr. King also understood the power of pragmatic solidarity. He inspired rabbis and white clergy and so many other people of conscience to join the freedom struggle. And it's a little hard to imagine that 50 years, actually 55 years after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the crowning achievement of the civil rights struggle, we would still be needing to defend the right to vote in our current day and age. I believe that this is a moment where people of goodwill, of every background, should unite in order to ensure that we can have free, fair, and safe elections in this country. Sojourners joined forces with the National African American Clergy Network to try to push back against voter suppression tactics we saw in the state of Georgia, but also in states all across the country. We deployed chaplains at polling sites to ensure that people could vote safely. And this is a moment where I believe it is imperative for us to unite to show solidarity in protecting the right to vote. Second, the path of the transformed nonconformist requires what I call Ubuntu interdependence. I learned about Ubuntu when I had a chance to first travel to South Africa in 1996. I was a student at Emory, but I had a chance to travel abroad and study abroad in Cape Town. Ubuntu, simply put, by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, means I am because we are. I remember learning Zulu. I've forgotten most of it, but the one two words that have stuck in my head the most are the Zulu greeting that says sawubona, which means I see you. And the response is siakona, which means I am here. And this greeting is based in this Ubuntu understanding that until you see me, I don't fully exist. In other words, we see ourselves into existence, right? Ubuntu echoes the ethic articulated best by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 58, when he describes a kind of fasting and worship that pleases God. He says, only after we break the yoke of injustice and feed the hungry will our light shine like a noonday, and we will become repairers of the breach, restorers of streets with dwellings. In other words, our wholeness, our liberation is tied up in the liberation and wholeness of others. This is the expression of what Ubuntu is all about. And I believe that COVID has been the fundamental test of Ubuntu. Somehow, we managed to make wearing a mask some kind of partisan exercise or partisan issue, when we knew and still know that wearing a mask and practicing social distancing is one of the most effective ways that we can love ourselves and love our neighbors at the same time. Now we have an opportunity to ensure that all Americans, particularly those who are most marginalized, have access to a vaccine. But it's going to take civic leaders and religious leaders and all of us to break through some of the distrust and the disinformation that currently exists around vaccines. I hope that you'll join us in kind of taking a personal pledge that not only you'll get the vaccine when you're eligible, that you'll share that information with your family and loved ones, that you will encourage others to get a vaccine as a way of living into Ubuntu. Third is a commitment to courage. We know that Dr. King exhibited extraordinary courage, but what we forget is just how unpopular he became because of some of his courageous stances against the Vietnam War, and even some of his work around economic justice in the latter stage of his activism. According to an early 1968 Harris poll, Dr. King died with a disapproval rating of nearly 75%. It is an absolutely shocking figure if you kind of think about it, particularly the way he's remembered in history today. But I'm glad that Dr. King had the courage to take positions that were neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. He was willing to stand for what is right. We are facing a severe deficit of courage in our politics today. Just look at the recent impeachment proceedings, where most Republicans in the Senate hid behind a dubious procedural argument that the trial was unconstitutional, therefore they couldn't convict the former president of impeachable offenses of inciting an insurrection. And I'm not trying to make a partisan statement here. What I'm trying to do is say that we have to be willing to take risks. We have to show courage to do what is right. That is certainly what John Lewis stood for and exercised during his entire life as well. I faced a test of courage after I came back from spending a summer in Zambia and South Africa, where I came face to face with the crisis of HIV and AIDS. At that time, nearly a quarter to a third of the adult population was facing a death sentence. I came back determined to try to break the silence around the AIDS crisis in the United States. I had an opportunity to create an organization called Global Justice, and our first campaign, the Student Global AIDS Campaign, engaged in letter writing and in protests and in writing op-eds and in lobby visits. And we're working in concert with many others, but we played a role in convincing Congress to create the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and ultimately helped convince the Bush administration to create the President's Emergency AIDS Plan. It was a plan that literally helped to save the lives of 13 million people across sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. I believe that initiative helped to reverse the tide of the AIDS pandemic across the world, and literally was a crowning achievement of the Bush administration. But it took courage. It took being willing to push back against silence and a lack of political leadership. Fourth, transform nonconformists require sacrifice. Sacrifice is tied to the Latin word passion, which means to suffer. It's the same word used to describe the suffering or crucifixion of Jesus. And passion elicits questions like, about what do I care deeply? What am I willing to sacrifice for? And what are the limits of my sacrifice? Dr. King was willing to sacrifice everything, even his own life, for the cause of justice. He faced imprisonment, death threats, and ultimately an assassination. And yes, I recognize that's a very high bar, but all of us, I think, can lean a little bit more into sacrifices that help to advance justice. I had a chance to go to Ferguson, Missouri in 2015 after the death and murder of Michael Brown. And I sat with leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, people like Brittany Packnett and D. Ray McKesson and many others. And we were a group of faith leaders who were listening to the struggles they were going through in Ferguson. And they asked us a penetrating question, which was, how much were we willing to sacrifice so that everyone can be made free? It wasn't enough that we were preaching about the crisis of racialized policing. It wasn't enough that we were writing letters or doing lobby visits. Were we willing to put our bodies and our reputations on the line? Now, everyone has to answer that question a little bit differently. But I believe this is a moment for sacrifice to transform our policing, to help pass legislation like the Justice for Policing Act, and for us to truly lean into a commitment to racial justice and to racial equity. Fifth and finally, transform nonconformism requires moral vision. The moral vision that inspired me the most is the one that animated the civil rights movement, which is the vision of the beloved community. I'm amazed that despite all that Dr. King went through, he still refused to hate those who threatened his life and his family. He responded to hate with radical love because he believed that only love could turn an enemy into a friend. My most simple definition of the beloved community is building a society in which neither punishment nor privilege is viciously or systematically tied to race, ethnicity, skin color, gender, sexual orientation. It is a society in which our racial and other forms of diversity becomes respected and celebrated and seen as a strength and not a weakness. Now, this moral vision may seem like a lot to achieve, but I believe that we desperately need a unifying moral vision for our nation right now. I actually just finished my second book, which is entitled A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community. And I don't have time to go into details about the beloved community, but I do believe is a moral vision for the times that we're in today. I want to close with this. I don't know if any of you are movie buffs in this virtual house that we're in right now, but I have an 8 and 10-year-old sons, and we are a Marvel family. One of the gifts of the pandemic is that it's given us more time to watch movies together. We literally watched every Marvel movie sequentially over the holidays. Now, hands down, the quintessential best Marvel movie is Black Panther. Sorry if you think it's something else, but I will gladly debate you on that point. Now, if you haven't seen the movie Black Panther and don't really have an idea what I'm talking about, Black Panther takes place in a country called Wakanda, an African country that is able to leapfrog the rest of the world in its military and technological advancement due to their possession of a rare metal called vibranium. Now, vibranium also gives the Wakandans superhuman intelligence and strength. And I believe that what vibranium does for Wakanda, our spirituality can do for us in the context of transformed nonconformism. Yes, there is a source of spiritual vibranium that so often sustains and strengthens the transformed nonconformist. And that's needed because the journey of justice is a long one that requires perseverance and fortitude. You remember at the end of the movie, for those of you who've seen it, King T'Challa realizes that vibranium is not meant only to be used to protect the people of Wakanda. No, it's ultimately meant to be a gift that's used to liberate and protect the entire world. Well, I believe we're in a similar decision moment where we have to decide how we're going to use our gifts and our talents in the context of building the beloved community, of building a radically more just and inclusive America and world. It's similar to another favorite movie of mine that came out when I was in Emory called The Matrix. Some of you remember that moment when Orpheus asked Neo whether he wants to swallow the red or the blue pill. And he can either remain asleep and sit on the sidelines, or he can go and join this cause of liberation and of struggle. Well, you have a similar decision to make. Will you join this struggle to co-create a radically more just and inclusive America? Will you decide that you will help to build the beloved community? During this Black History Month, I hope that you will take the path of the transformed nonconformists, whatever that looks like and means for you. I hope and pray that you will embrace a commitment to pragmatic solidarity, to Ubuntu interdependence, that you will demonstrate courage and sacrifice, that you will cast a moral vision of building the beloved community. So Emory University students, alumni, and friends, now is the time to tap into some spiritual vibranium. It is time to transform our nation and world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. It's so great to have you back home at Emory, and that was a very, very powerful message. Many rich things for us to think about today, and we hope that those who are with us today as participants will please add questions and comments in the chat. Already we have one comment from someone who says that they have really appreciated your insight and understanding of the movement and the fact that you speak from a place of intimate understanding. And obviously you're deeply engaged in what you're speaking about. I might ask a first question as people start to put their questions into the chat, which is, I think that especially in light of the pandemic time that we're in, and the many tragedies that there have been over the course of the year, people that, people being killed, some of whom were known to us, some of whom not known, leaders in many of the struggles that we have looked up to. You referenced this in part, but where do you see the signs of hope? How do you keep yourself going when, it feels like you're in a David and Goliath moment, and, some of the issues ahead of us are large, they're complex, they're not new, which is not to say there hasn't been some progress, but there's still a long, long way to go, we know. So just curious how what your practices are for kind of maintaining hope in the face of large challenges.
Yeah, no, thanks. A great question. Well, I have to admit, I have been able to gain a lot of hope by, this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, that's now gone global. I mean, the amount of protests in the United States, people of all walks of life and ages and races that joined together, not just in the summer, but certainly before that and after. And then the fact that it went really global across the world and has now been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think is fitting. So that's been deeply inspirational and encouraging. I think you mentioned this, that I was an active member of the Voices of Inner Strength, and it wasn't because I was such a gifted singer. I'm basically tone deaf, but I fortunately was able to stay in the choir. But I'm a huge fan of gospel music, and one of my favorite songs is by Yolanda Adams, and the song is the core lyric is, "This battle is not yours, it's the Lord's." And I think a huge source of hope for me is that ultimately I try to remember that, if I try to do this thing on my own, I will burn out. And I've, certainly experienced that at different stages in my career. But again, when I kind of been able to root myself in my faith and remember that ultimately, particularly as a Christian, the rules, ultimate outcome is kind of known. I mean, if we really believe in the resurrection, then Christ did conquer death and sin and injustice on our behalf. And we are called to help ensure that thy kingdom does come to this earth. And so, while that can be very hard, and there's lots of, signs where it sometimes feel like we're going backwards and not forwards, I really do believe that the arc of the moral universe does bend toward justice, as Dr. King described. And then ultimately, when we lean on our faith, we can actually tap into some real strength and fortitude. I think the final thing is just being really grounded in my marriage and a strong family. I mean, I'm deeply grateful for my wife, Cherie. She pours all kinds of strength into me, and also kind of keeps me in check when, I'm making things too much about me, or I'm kind of, being too hard on myself. She's always there to get me back on track.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we do have a few questions in the chat now, and we certainly welcome more. And this one comes from one participant who says, thank you so much for this presentation. Sometimes it feels as though there are so many complex issues to address. What are some practical next steps that someone can take to become involved as a transforming nonconformist?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, if you're not doing this already, I would really encourage you to read more rigorously about our history. I think I didn't have a chance to kind of cover this in my talk, but one of the things I emphasize in my new book is that, echoing the words of Jesus, the truth really, really will set us free. And I think one of the reasons why we're so divided as a country is we have such misunderstandings or such lack of understanding of our own history. And, I hate to say it, but in high school, I wasn't really taught much about the era of Reconstruction or too much about what led to the creation of the Jim Crow system. It was kind of an afterthought in our history classes. It wasn't actually until I came to Emory and was able to study a course around Black politics that I was able to be exposed to much more of that. And so I really think this is a moment to do that. And I would highly recommend a number of books, but certainly Ibram Kendi's anti-racism book is a really good one. Also recommend a more recent book by Isabel Wilkerson that is all about kind of comparing racism to a caste system. And there's many others that I could cite, but I do think we need to dig into our history more. The other thing is that you've got to identify what is the cause that really animates you. I mean, you're right, we can't work on everything, and it can be overwhelming. But I do think that God does place in our hearts and in our spirits a passion for something. And maybe that's issues of environmental racism or climate change for you. Maybe that's gun violence. Maybe that's poverty. But start with an issue that you're passionate about, learn about it, become informed about it, and then find an organization that can be an effective vehicle for you to be able to act on that issue. And of course, finding community is really important in the midst of that as well. Activism is not meant to be a solo sport, if you will. So, being able to join organizations like Sojourners, and certainly if there are some of the campaigns that we're doing, it would be a good fit. We'd love to have you join some of the work we're doing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, actually, would you be willing just to tell us a little bit about some of the initiatives that Sojourners is engaged in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a ongoing campaign that is really trying to essentially safeguard and protect the right to vote. We'll be doing work to try to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which was just renamed after he passed this last year, through Congress. And that act would help to basically restore the teeth to the Voting Rights Act in 1965. There was a Supreme Court case in 2013 that basically gutted the Voting Rights Act and made it no longer necessary for Southern states in particular to report to the Justice Department if they're going to change any voting policies or laws. And so we've seen this kind of open season of new laws that are making it more difficult to vote, particularly for communities of color. And we need to ensure that we can reverse that. So there's a lot of work that's happening around that we'd love to have you join. We're also doing a lot of work, as I mentioned, to try to get the Justice for Policing Act passed, which would take another number of steps to really transform policing in our country. So love to have your support on that. We've got a campaign focused on climate justice. We are going to be working with the new Biden administration to try to ensure that much more progress is made around access to renewable energy and reducing our carbon emissions. But I really believe climate change is an existential threat, both to humanity, but also to the planet. And so particularly for younger generations, I mean, that is a cause that is really critical. And then, there's work that needs to be done at kind of a theological level, particularly if you are active in a church or you're part of a ministry, to really make a kind of commitment to anti-racism a theological priority. And we're actually developing some curriculum related to that we could also share.
Adam, that's really helpful. I'm seeing a few questions here. We have one from a professor of Buddhism, actually, who's teaching socially engaged Buddhism at Candler, and said that she really appreciates your mention of many of her heroes. Thich Nhat Hanh and Dr. Ambedkar, also come to mind as well. And it just raises someone else also asking about some interfaith activist work. Does Sojourners engage in much work, in terms of interfaith relationships? I know that President Obama had a very interfaith community engagement kind of task force. Curious if you know anything about plans that might be underway in the Biden-Harris administration, or just kind of any opportunities that might span across different traditions too.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the Biden administration literally just announced on Sunday that they are, through an executive order, recreating the White House Office on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. And a friend and someone I had a chance to work with when I was, in a lot of different parts of my career, named Melissa Rogers, leading that office as the executive director. So it's great that the Biden administration is going to revitalize this kind of infrastructure of faith-based offices across the federal government, which provide both an entry point for faith-based organizations and secular organizations to be able to kind of navigate the federal government, but also to really try to ensure that faith leaders and others have a real seat at the table and can kind of influence some of the priorities going forward. We do a lot of multi-faith work. Actually, in our Lawyers and Colors Turnout Sunday program on voter protection, we were joined by rabbis in a number of our states, including Michigan and Pennsylvania, so we were grateful for that. We're involved in co-convening a multi-faith initiative right now that's trying to convince both counties, states, and the federal government to enable houses of worship to be vaccination distribution sites. Partly because, you know, there are houses of worship everywhere. There's 350,000 of them in the United States. And so in terms of like access, it's a kind of obvious thing. Plus, religious leaders tend to enjoy quite a bit of trust within their communities. And so they could be some of the most successful places to encourage people to get the vaccine. That is already happening in some places, but it's very hit or miss. And we're trying to kind of make that more of a systematic thing. So alongside like CVS, you could actually go to your house of worship and get your vaccine there as well. So I'm pretty excited about that. And that's a multi-faith initiative.
That's great. That's great to know about. Thank you so much. Related to this question, there's actually a theological question. I know that you studied, I think, international relations or politics at Emory, but you've gone on to do a lot of theological study and work beyond that. How do you, as a Christian leader, how do you connect with interfaith activist work? I mean, how do you manage your personal faith convictions sort of in relationship with partners of other faiths?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, let me emphasize that Christians or people of faith do not have a monopoly on morality. So one of the things that Dr. King did so brilliantly is that he was unapologetic about his Christian faith and what motivated him. But he also appealed to the values and the promises found in our Constitution and to our civic values. And he created a welcoming space for all Americans to join the struggle for civil rights and for human dignity. And so I try to take a similar approach. I mean, certainly, I'm sure that I fall short of that ideal, but, I am deeply committed to creating inclusive movements, not just interreligiously, but also with people that are atheists and agnostic or people that are spiritual but not religious. That's actually the fastest growing semi-denomination in the country right now, to be honest. And so, Sojourners, while, we are kind of a vehicle that primarily inspires and mobilizes Christians, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, et cetera. Again, we have lots of relationships and we form a lot of coalitions, enter into a lot of coalitions with lots of other faith traditions, but also secular organizations as well.
Thank you. So we have one person who says, it's always great to see you, Brother Taylor. Do you think it's harder to be a transformed nonconformist and affect change, given the bitter nonpartisan divides, obstructionism, in our government today?
No, it's made it much harder. I mean, to be honest, I think we're kind of in a cold civil war and have been for the last number of years. Sadly, I think President Trump exacerbated that considerably. He certainly didn't create it entirely. We were a divided country before he became president, but I like to call him the grand entrepreneur of division. And, I think his style of politics very much played into that. But we all have to take responsibility for trying to kind of heal our democracy, if you will. And some of it is tied to just how hyper segregated we still are as a society. I didn't mention this because I didn't think I had time, but there was a survey that was done in 2016 called the American Values Survey, also done by this polling firm PRI. And they basically asked Americans of all stripes whether they had, basically who was in your close social circle that you trusted, that you talked to regularly. And what they found is 70% of white Americans didn't have a single person of color in their close social circle, whether it's a coworker, a friend, a neighbor, what have you. And so, how as a country are we going to overcome so many of the biases and prejudices that get in the way of working together if we really, don't have close relationships? And I'm not saying that would solve everything, but at least to be a major step. The other piece is that, polling shows that we've reached a really dangerous point in our politics where it's become very much a kind of us versus them situation. And Republicans and Democrats no longer don't just dislike each other, they actually hate each other. You kind of look at what polling is telling us. And to me, like, certainly in my Christian faith, Christ calls us to love our enemies. So, you know, even if I was to see Republicans as my enemy, which I don't, I'm still called to love them, right? And we're still called to try to find common ground, to work together in order to solve common challenges. And so, you know, I think there really is a struggle right now that's happening over the soul of the Republican Party. And I'm prayerful that will lead in a direction that can kind of reject some of the Trumpisms that we've seen over the last 4 years and kind of re-embrace this reality that we are increasingly becoming a multiracial democracy. And that could be a source of celebration, that could be a source of pride, or it could be a source of fear and trepidation. And I think Trump really played on a lot of people's fears, but there's nothing that's stopping us from also playing on some of their core values and their kind of sense that they too would have a place in this new America, and that new America that we're trying to build together would enable all of us to thrive.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one or two more questions if you're
willing
to take them. It's very rich. I have a question about, you mentioned the kind of crisis of truth that we're in right now. It almost seems as though different sides in the country have different sets of facts that they're working with. How do you see a way forward, you know, in a situation in which we have this kind of, you know, disagreement on this kind of very, very, you know, basic facts? You mentioned the difference between seeing something as seeing, you know, acts of what I would call racial injustice as, you know, just, you know, isolated incidents versus a systemic racism. What, beyond higher education, hopefully at a place like Emory, which should be involved in that. The Sojourners involved in that kind of work as well, or how do you see the way?
No, it's a really serious problem. And I think it's helped to supercharge a lot of the polarization that we're seeing and experiencing. I think social media has played a key role here, probably because it is playing to people's preconceived biases and kind of enabling them to create their own bubble where they're not exposed to different points of view. It's not the only, you know, challenge or cause, but it's a significant one. And so I think part of the solution, particularly kind of grounding this in faith, is that houses of worship need to be at the forefront of telling the truth. And it's not always easy to do. A lot of people sometimes, not just people, but a lot of faith leaders are worried about, you know, losing members and offending their flock, if you will. But they really owe it to their congregations to try to help them understand what is true and what is not, to kind of sift that through. And, you know, I've heard a number of pastors kind of share with me in confidence that they want to speak out more, but don't really know how to. And they feel like, you know, Fox News has their congregation for 10 hours a day and they only get them 1 hour on a Sunday. And I get that challenge. But to me, that can't be an excuse. That can't be exonerating ourselves of responsibility. You know, we have to preach the gospel in a way that cuts through some of those mistruths or lies and ultimately tries to, you know, help people understand kind of what is a verifiable truth, right? And this is where I feel like the lie about the election being stolen was a particularly poisonous one, because it is literally undermining people's trust in future elections. And it's what I think fueled so many people to kind of take arms into their own hands and lay siege to the Capitol. And that lie could have been dispelled had we had more courage from pastors across the country, from politicians on both sides, particularly from Republicans, and really, literally from, you know, a president that could have decided to do what every president before him has done, which is to concede once it was clear he lost the election. And literally, I mean, as we know, he took it to the courts, 50 different courts at every level, including the Supreme Court, decided he did not have enough evidence to show that there was widespread election fraud. And yet he continued to promulgate this lie that continued to get magnified by many more conservative media outlets. And so, you know, I think we have to be more courageous in speaking out against that, including in the context of the church.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Adam Russell Taylor. I see that we are approaching the hour. So I just want to thank you so much for coming home to Emory and being with us today. You know, the challenges that we all face are great, but I think that you have given us some reason for hope, some signs of hope, and certainly the work of Sojourners does that as well. I've long been an admirer of Sojourners and looking forward to remaining even closer, hopefully, and bringing Emory closer now that you're there and as the president. So thank you so much again. We look forward to staying in touch, and certainly for the members of Voices of Inner Strength who have joined us today, hope that you can stay on for a reception with Reverend Taylor after this. And we just want to thank you so much again. Thank you for all of your tremendous work and a really powerful word today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.